Hey guys, happy Friday! It is time for your Friday Pod.Snack. And we're still talking about self-awareness. We're still talking about what actually is self-awareness and how to do it. Last week, I talked about the first two-ish parts of the definition of self-awareness. Today, we're going to talk about part 3. Okay, so a quick recap. Self-awareness, the definition that we're working with, is a conscious presence to the elements of our whole individual being, our relationship to them, and our expression of them. Okay, last week we talked about, starting with what is awareness? Well, it is a conscious presence to something. In this case, self-awareness is a little bit more than like a passive presence to something. It's a conscious presence to something. It's a little bit more of an active, engaged process. We also talked about what are the elements of your whole individual being? Well, those are things like your motivations, your value system, your internal belief, your thoughts, your memories, your desires, anything and everything that makes you you. Those are the elements of your whole being. And in my world, the way that I practice this stuff is that no element of you is inherently good or bad. We give value to those elements by what we do with them. So we talked about superpower kryptonites last week. I hope you watched it, and if you haven't, go do that, and also still tell me what your superpower kryptonite is. Now, there's two parts left of this definition: our relationship to the elements of our whole individual being and our expression of the elements of our whole individual being. Now, I think that a lot of times when people think about self-awareness, if I were to just ask you how you would define self-awareness, you might say something like knowledge of who I am and the things that I do. I think most people don't really think about that it's just as important to be aware of how you relate with self, and that is as much a part of self-awareness as is who you are and how you act upon the world. Okay, so little background context. One of my biggest sort of, origin story pieces of my work is in authentic relating. Authentic relating is a group practice that uses relationships as a lens for self-awareness, and self-awareness as a tool for developing greater relationships with better connection. I facilitated that kind of stuff for about 10 years. It's also very much my sort of way of being, way of living and existing in the world. It's how I connect with other people. It's how I coach. It's actually the foundation for my coaching practice. Authentic relating and everything that I learned from that very much influences how I think about self-awareness. And it's probably the origin of this piece for me about your relationship with self. So the interesting thing about our relationships with self is that it very, very, very much impacts the actions that we do or the expression of ourselves, and even the elements of who we are. So both sides of this definition kind of hinge upon our relationship to self. Let's break that down a little bit. Your relationship to self very much determines the actions with which you will do. If you, for example, really love an element of yourself, let's say that you view yourself as funny, you love that about yourself, well, you are going to use humor more in your day-to-day life. You're going to celebrate that part of you. You're going to express yourself in that kind of way because you love that part of yourself. Okay, now let's say the opposite of that is true. Let's say that you really think that you are not funny. Well, you're probably not going to use humor to try to connect with anybody else. So here we now have a limitation of the expression of you. Your relationship to self, in this case, this example being like an internal judgment of the positive value or negative impact of an element of you, very much impacts the expression of you and the actions that you're willing to take. I imagine that you've probably heard the phrase, if you think you can, and if you think you can't, you can't. Well, that is actually very much grounded in science. Science and data tells us that if you believe that you can do something, you are so much more likely to at least try to do it. If you believe that you can't, you won't even attempt to. There's actually some really interesting studies. They've duplicated this a few times, so studies is probably the better word than study. But basically the premise is a group of individuals goes into a school, a less privileged area with children who have low performance on test scores. These are kids who really sort of get the message that they're not going to amount to anything. This group of individuals come in and they teach these kids about neuroplasticity and that all of our brains have the capacity to learn and evolve and grow. And just by teaching them about neuroplasticity, nothing else, just teaching them about neuroplasticity and the possibility of change and growth, these kids start to do better on standardized tests. Which, you know what, standardized tests is a whole nother conversation. They're not great. But the point is that they do actually show improvement, which is pretty cool, just by learning that it's possible. That's actually exactly what growth mindset is. And it's the same thing here. How you relate with self, your beliefs about yourself, very much impact what you do and whether you're even willing to try. So self-awareness includes a conscious presence to how we relate with ourselves and our judgments of them, because that impacts the actions that we do. Okay, now let's steer that back to the first part of this definition, which is the elements of our whole being. I think that how we relate with ourselves, what we think about ourselves, our judgments of ourselves as being positive or negative, actually has the power to shape who we are. And the reason is, again, if you believe that you can, that you're capable, that you have a positive outlook on your potential, you will do the action, but also you will start to instill beliefs that you are capable. And if we talk about the elements of who we are, that includes our core beliefs. And that's sort of a little bit of the key takeaway that I want you to have from this, that your relationship to self has the power to shape who you are in a positive or a negative way. So yes, you might have developed some unpleasant beliefs about yourself over the period of your life, or some unpleasant beliefs about certain parts of you over the period of your life. But working on that relationship to self and using your relationship to self as sort of like your way in can also help you unwind those beliefs that aren't really serving you in the best possible way. And how do we do that? Well, it all comes back to notice, own, and welcome. The other thing that I will say is that when you can relate with yourself from a space of neutrality, as opposed to even a judgment of positive or negative, you're going to give yourself a lot more space to unpack what's actually there and real and true. And that is essential for any kind of healing process to take place. You have to be willing to actually see what is there before you can work with it. A judgment of positive or negative is kind of like giving it direction. If we judge it as positive, we're going to do something out in the world with it. We want to share it. We want to give it to the world. We want it to celebrate it. We want to give it to ourselves. If we judge something as negative, we want to smoosh it down. We want to put it into a closet. That's also wanting to do something with it. We want to throw it away. Neutrality is just space. It's just like standing still, almost like a big breath of fresh air. And if we want to become more consciously present to something, we do need to stand still and take a look at it. So my invitation to you this weekend is actually just to meditate. 20 minutes. 20 minutes with self. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to look within. And I want you to get a little bit of a lay of the land. What is the landscape of you? Take a little bit of stock. What parts do you like? What parts do you not like? And as you do this, I want you to do so from a place of almost like a neutral observer. Not you that is judging the lay of the land, but just you as a neutral observer looking out onto the landscape of your life and who you are. And that's it. Enjoy the ride. And I'll talk to you next week.